Okay guys, welcome to your video tutorial for 8.1.1. There is two kind of subheadings under this dot point, the social context of software design. The first one is ergonomics and the second one is inclusivity. So we are going to look at ergonomics first. So this is the dot point that we're going through today, ergonomic issues regarding software design. Some of you in some of your other subjects, or if you did IST in year 9 and 10, may have heard of this term ergonomics. We are going to first clarify what ergonomics is, and then look at how in these 4 ways, so screen design, ease of use, messaging and consistency of the UI is really important for our users. So, we're going to be talking about GUIs or UIs again. I know we've just talked about intellectual property, so I'll just give you a reminder. GUI, UI, user interface, all the same words, and they are the screen designs and connections between the screen that allows a user to interact with the software. Fancy way of saying, you obviously have a piece of software, your user has to use it. It's the graphical interface that they use to navigate around or perform commands in your user interface. No, in your software application. Sorry, ignore that. Okay, so here's the big question. Okay, and it's one of the most important parts of designing an ergonomic, which we'll clarify again in a minute, an ergonomic UI. How do I, as a developer, design a GUI that allows for an intuitive experience for my user? They're really fancy words. Basically, and it seems a little bit odd, but you don't really want your user to have to think all that much when they're using your particular application. And I know that sounds a bit odd, but you want it to be so natural for them that they don't have to think, that the file menu is where they expect it, that the button for exit looks like an exit button and they don't really have to think, I wonder where the exit button is. If your user interface is ergonomic and successful, your user won't have to actually think too much when using your application. And that's the aim. So how do you as a developer get an intuitive experience for your user? Well, you follow the following 4 things. You create a user interface that has effective screen design. You follow some rules so it's easy to use. You feed back messages to your user that are clear, and you make sure things in your user interface are where they are expected and you consistently put them in that place. So in terms of effective screen design, we're going to go through a number of things. This is probably the biggest, most chunkiest of all of the 4. So the 4 here, effectiveness of screen design is the biggest one. The first thing we're going to go through is screen elements. Now, you use different screen elements for different purposes. Some screen elements are so your user can feed data into your system, or some of them are just, general things that will allow your user to navigate or control something. So I'm going to go onto this screen just ever so quickly because the first thing that we're going to look at are radio buttons. Then we're going to have a look at these guys, check boxes. We're going to look at a list box, a combo box, and finally a text box. They are for when users need to input data into your system, and all of these, while they look very different, are used for different types of information. So the real key thing here that you guys need to be able to know is okay, I want my user to input this kind of information, therefore I need to use this kind of screen element. Now, you can actually use, for one type of data, you could use a radio button, or you could technically achieve the same task with a checkbox. What you guys need to get good at is distinguishing which one is more right. It's a bit of an Animal Farm situation, if any of you guys have studied that book before. Some screen elements are right, but some more right than others. So the first one is a radio button. Most of you guys will look at this and say, oh yeah, that multiple choice button. Please never, ever, 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 ever call it a multiple choice button ever again. Its technical term and the subject-specific terminology you need to use is radio button. You use this when you want your user to select one option from a limited series of options. So if you have, 5 things that you want your user to choose from, yep, you can give them 5 radio buttons as a screen element, and if you put them in a series, they'll only be able to check 1. So, what year group are you in? You could definitely have those as, 5 radio buttons. However, you might want your user to be able to select multiple options from a limited series. So that's these guys over here. You notice that, you don't necessarily just have to be one of these things. You might have multiple options. So when you want the user to select more than one, checkbox is a really important screen element. The next screen element seems to, have very similar options to both radio buttons and checkboxes. It's called a list box. It's when you want the user to select, they could just select one or multiple items from a list. Now, I could achieve that with checkboxes, couldn't I? My user doesn't necessarily have to tick them. They could tick one or multiple. So why on the earth do I have a list box? Why bother having this screen element where, you can select one or multiple? Why not just have lots of checkboxes? Well, this is part of ergonomic screen design, or, selecting like I said before, the most correct screen element. If I have 25 values and I put in my user interface 25 checkboxes, it tends to get really messy. My UI starts to look, unclean. On our face-to-face day, or, in our classroom, guys, you said it was really easy to identify what a bad UI is, but you couldn't really tell me why. That cluttering is one of the reasons why, screen design or the selection of screen elements is so important. Because what a list box will allow me to do is contain all that information in one nice, neat package. So my user can still perform the function of selecting one or multiple like they could with a checkbox, but it's if I have more than, say, 5 or 6 screen elements. 5 or 6 possible options, it can be contained really nice within a list box. So that's the almost more right option when I want my user to select one or multiple items, but I have a lot of them. In terms of a combination box is kind of similar to a radio button, but again, it's around making the most correct choice. So say I wanted, my user to select one item over here, and I might have, 5, 10, 15 potential options. I can use a combination box when I want my user to select 1 items from a long list, but it actually also gives me the option of typing in my own additional potential ideas. So I know some of you guys see this when there's a limited series of data. You see radio buttons, option 1, option 2, option 3, other, and it gives your users an opportunity to write in some unique text. But instead of, option 1, option 2, option 3, maybe I have 27 options and then another. How could I do that? Well, 27 radio buttons on my user interface would look pretty horrible. So the more correct, if I have a lot of options or a lot of pieces of data in my series, is a combo box, because it will still allow my user to select only one item or type in their option. The final input screen element is a text box, and it's when I want my user to enter really unique data. Can I give you a word of advice with text boxes? Use them very discretionally. That's a fancy way of saying only use them when you need them. First names, last names, passwords. Something where you cannot predict the answers. Let me give you a really good example. A couple of years ago, a form went out for Year 7 blazer fittings. And it was a user interface. And it asked the parents to put in the first name, the last name as a text box. And then instead of having, a radio button or it actually probably would have been better, a radio button, as an option for homeroom, it just said homeroom and had a text box. Now, could you have predicted homerooms? Yeah, you could have. You know, in year 7, there's only 6 homerooms. That's only 6 possible options. But instead, the person who designed the user interface put it in as a text box. What was the issue? Here's the kind of responses that came out of when we had to extract the information from the system and, use it somehow elsewhere. Here's the options I got for homeroom. Lab 3, Mrs. Smith, not too sure. 7 purple in brackets, I think. Year 7, I don't know, we have a casual teacher at the moment. There was about 75,000 different options for homeroom, and it made it really tough to organise because the uniform shop needed to organise it via homeroom, and all the data there was inconsistent. So the person who designed that user interface could have easily made it a radio button. There were 6 options. You could have only selected one, and the data you were getting from the user would have been far more informative. As a result, we could not use much of that data that was coming out of the system to organise them into homerooms because the homerooms were woefully incorrect. So text box, great data entry field, used sparingly and only when you cannot predict the user's data. For example, you could predict the country of birth. You can just list every country. Yep, there will be a lot, but it'll be really good to do it as a combination box, yeah, not as a text box. You don't know what you could get with a text box. The other screen elements are just general. So I'm going to jump down to the next slide and show you guys a few. You will have seen command buttons, lots. You would have seen scroll bars, you would have seen toggles, and you would have seen sliders. These are the ones we're going to talk about. So a command button is general. It's its name, and you have to get used to calling it its correct subject-specific name. It's when you want the user to make a navigational choice. And what you usually do with this particular type of button is you write the choice on the actual screen element. So for example, here you want the user to know they selected and they hit OK. For this command button, you want the user to send a message. For this command button, your user is used to these icons, which we're going to talk about in a later dot point. Minimize, expand, close. They're all command buttons, okay? It's not a data entry field. You write what, you put on top of the command button, its actual function, and your user knows, oh, I click that, it's going to send a message. I click OK, it's going to take that input. I click that, it's going to close. And that's a command button. The next one is the scroll bar, and it's when you want the user to control the viewing of information. So this here, scroll bar. I can scroll up, I can scroll down. I'm not putting any text or data in, but they're really important. It's important to use scroll bars as a screen element in your design, particularly when you have a lot of information and you want the user to be able to control where exactly they're viewing it. More common screen elements that now exist have come about with the use of smartphones and touch devices. Yeah. So when you want the user to make a binary choice, i.e. on or off, yes or no, particularly on smartphones, a toggle button is used lots. So, Wi-Fi off and on, do not disturb mode, on or off. Yep, I would definitely use a toggle button. Slider. Slider is used for where you need to make more discrete choices. So you wouldn't use a toggle button for brightness, but when brightness has a scale, you can be 100 for all the way from 0 to 100. I use a slider. It'll allow my user to get almost immediate feedback as they're making the choices. So, as I move the brightness, I can actually see the brightness go up and down, and I can make a more discrete choice, or something like, volume's another example, something where I want my user to make more discrete choices rather than just on or off. And that's the screen elements, guys. So making the best choice, what you need to take from that is, what do I want the user to either do, or what data do I want the user to put in my system? What is the most correct screen element? Cool. The second, a part of effective screen design is the appropriate use of color. It's pretty self-explanatory, but you need to have a pretty big contrast between the text and the background. You also, in terms of color, need to consider viewing it on different devices. If you use, some really discrete color choice, it might not necessarily be able to be viewable on all devices. And last but not least, where possible, you should allow your users customization and choice. I know I have this argument with lots of people if they prefer dark mode or light mode. I am totally, mainly by myself in my choice of light mode. I have 100 nerds often yell at me and go, "No, miss, dark mode, dark mode, dark mode." But I'm a light mode fan. I will stay on my island by myself. If you have the option in your UI to give your user choice is always better for color because there is such personal preference. And for some people, it's actually about the visual and the ability to actually see that contrast, which may be affected by other conditions that they have. So where possible, allow your users customization and choice. In terms of appropriate fonts, please, for the love of everything sane, make good font choices. The font that I have used in this particular presentation has been chosen consistently. You'll notice that your fonts are consistent. Yeah, and I've used less than 3 in the whole entire presentation. It's not a UI, obviously, it's a presentation, but a similar concept exists. Be consistent with your choices, don't change your fonts, try and not use a whole lot throughout your UI. The last one, which might seem a bit odd, but it's an important one, is the alignment of data entry fields. So, text boxes aligned and left justified like this is common practice. It makes the user interface look consistent. And as I'm typing as a user in here, I go, cool, there's my name, there's my date of birth, which, by the way, shouldn't be a text box entry, which is spicy. My ID, here, some keywords. I got this from the textbook. It's actually a really bad design, ironically. Anyway, let's take it for what it was meant to be demonstrating, the alignment of data fields. See how they're all nicely aligned? My user won't have to think. As soon as they're moving their cursor left, right, their brain has to start thinking again. A reminder, ergonomic UIs, effective, intuitive UIs. My user doesn't have to think. Cool, ease of use. This is a really straightforward and simple one. The navigation around your user interface or your graphical user interface should be logical and natural. Similar items you should group together. So, over here we were grouping some data entry things. They should all be, grouped together. It should be able to be used all the way from experts to novices. You should not need a user manual on how to actually get around your UI. We'll talk about user manuals later. Yes, you'll have to provide your users with one, but it should be able to be easily used. Great part of ease of use is a lot of white or negative space. Your brain processes white or negative space in a different way, and if you don't overwhelm your users with, or if you don't provide your users with white or negative space, that's the big one that you guys will start to go, oh, the UI doesn't look clean. And part of your first initial response is how your brain, likes that white or negative space. Another big thing just about ease of use, if an option isn't available to a user yet, maybe you might need something else entered before they can enter a piece of data, you should grey that out. Yep, so there's, so your user immediately knows you can't enter that until you have entered the thing before. You should make it easy for them, guys. You shouldn't need, a roadmap to using your UI. Should be able to be used by a range of people. This is a big one. In talking about should be able to be used by a range of people, your messages to your user should be clear, give direction, and free of jargon. This is my favorite. You've probably seen this message before. An internal error occurred. As a person in IT, I don't really even know what that means. I'm like, cool, story, bro. Amazing. Like, very helpful. What does that mean? I don't really know. So you should really be really considerate when giving messages back to your user. Any technical language should really try and not be included unless, you have the message and then said, here's your error code. Because what will happen then, again, from novices to experts, if your user is having an issue and then, they might actually be the person in IT, because that's where the problem's escalated to. The person in IT has, oh, okay, I know that error code. I'll Google that error code. okay, fantastic, I can actually solve this problem. So, your messages should be clear, but assume in the first place your user knows nothing. They have to solve their own problems without any help, and your message box is the only chance you have to help them. If you come from that idea of thinking, every message you provide your user with will be sufficient. And the last thing is that good UIs are intuitive. I kept on using this word. Screen elements are where you expect them. They align generally with accepted or operating system features within your graphical user interface. So I'm just going to escape this for 10 seconds. Where do I expect to find a file button? Top left. Top left. Top left. Top left. If I am making my UI, why in God's name would I put a file menu over here? I will be consistent when making my UI because I will place my buttons generally where they are expected. If file buttons, are always up in this top left-hand corner, why am I putting my file menu down this left-hand side? Don't do it. Yeah. If I know, this is a really great example, and you probably see these all the time. If I know save is always on the left, cancel is always on the right, don't, in my messages to my user, swap the buttons around. Be consistent. And these are some examples of, obviously really poor UI. Poor UI again with clutter. Good, like better UI, more clean UI. And a bit of, bit of inception here, the UI that we are actually using. And that's it, guys. That is ergonomic screen design.